Hey, this is Ben, and in this video what we're going to do is try to give you a real basic rundown of two arguments for God's existence that are very commonly used, and just take a look at all the objections to them. And the goal of this video is to give you a very quick run through of all the objections. Instead of, like in the past, I might do one video, just one 25-minute video just on one objection. We're not going to do that in this video. This is my second attempt to make this video. I made an error before. But anyway, let's just get right to it. The first thing I recommend when giving these arguments is to use the bare bones premises. To just state out the premises of the argument and so like, there's like the moral argument might say there is an absolute morality. There can only be an absolute morality if God exists, therefore God exists. And what that does is it helps people object to you, because oftentimes they're a little confused if you just start going into defenses of the premises, and it helps people organize what we're talking about when you set up a framework like that. So let's start with the moral argument. The most common objection you're going to get from atheists is that atheists can be moral too. And the issue here is that this isn't actually disagreement with the argument at all. So that's the issue there. They are just affirming the second premise. That's just an affirmation of the second premise. The way the moral argument works is it says that we all know there's such a thing as right and wrong. And then the issue with the first premise is, how can there be such a thing as right and wrong if there is no moral lawgiver? Okay. Now you could have the evolution objection that morality is the byproduct of millions of years of evolution. Animals that had morality were more likely to survive. Now, for the first problem with saying that evolution explains morality is it would mean that all of the morals that we hold to are actually illusions created by biological processes. So that we could have evolved a totally different way and all of our morals would no longer be real. So like, alligators, in alligator offspring, the males eat their own offspring, and what this does is it ensures that the fastest offspring are the ones that get away, and it's a survival of the fittest, and it helps create like a genetic strength to the whole thing. But we consider that very immoral. So like that would be an issue. So in other words, if someone says this, it means that they don't believe anything is actually wrong. It's just a sense experience that's really an illusion created by millions of years of evolution, but there is no such thing as right and wrong. So you could just say, well, if someone robs your house, do you think that's wrong, or do you think that's the notion that it's wrong is just an illusion created by evolution? You could go further with this. So let's imagine that we are all biochemical machines, and all of our thoughts are just, different brain states, and we don't have souls like what they're saying, and that all of our thoughts are just random accidents that happen in this complicated biochemical machine. Let's say that there exists some supernatural being. I'll say a magical troll. There's a magical troll that that's not that's outside of this. Let's just say for the sake of this that this thing exists and wants to program us, the machines, with morality. Well, the question arises is, how do you program a machine with morality? So like you can think about it this way. You can program a machine with a goal, do this. Like you can program your GPS with a goal of like get you to this hard to find location. And it can be a complicated goal, and the machine might have to calculate all sorts of other stuff about how to get to that goal. And the machine might even be able to learn information. There's even you could even have a learning machine that would learn, like, okay, that didn't work as well as or this worked better than the other way that we did it. But whatever it would do, it would always function according to its base programming. So So the issue is how do you program a machine with morals? In other words, a machine's always going to function as it's programmed. There may be errors, or you may program it incorrectly if you're the magical troll, but it's always going to function how you programmed it. If there's something wrong with it, it's not machine's fault. It's just always running according to its programming. You can get mad at it and, get angry at it, but that's kind of silly when you think about it. Okay, so the point is morals are fundamentally persuasive. And so, like, even if morals arose randomly through some sort of physical accident, they would be meaningless to the machines. In other words, the issue here is that it's not just that morality, your experience of morals, would be an illusion, but rather you couldn't even be experiencing them. So the fact that you're experiencing the morals, in other words, not only are the morals an illusion, the idea that you are experiencing them is also an illusion. You're not actually experiencing the illusion of morality, the illusion of this. Okay, so you see what I'm saying? Yeah, so like I say, do and don't are just in different categories from should and shouldn't. Or, so like, you can program a machine do this, but the machine's not going to care if it, if you take the GPS and you say, hey, let's not, like you program it to go to some location and then you just steer somewhere else, then the GPS will just operate. It will just say, recalculating, go this way. Because that's how it's programmed, just to do that. It doesn't care if you ever get there. It doesn't think it's good or bad. It's just following its programming. It has no way of ever... The idea of good and bad would always be meaningless to something that just does what it's programmed to do. Now, if you alter your concept of the physical to where physical machines can actually make choices, well, then you've altered your concept of the physical to where it's not physical anymore. Well, how is that, what's the difference between the physical and the non-physical at that point? I mean, that's the core difference, is that physical objects function according to their inherent physical properties. That oxygen bonds with hydrogen because that's the properties it has. Not that it thinks like, well, maybe I'll bond with hydrogen, maybe I won't. Okay. Right now, the next objection is the teenager objection. And teenagers always say that morality is subjective. And what the teenager is always going to do is they're going to provide you with one example of moral confusion. So one example you might hear is that, they might talk about how societies in the past thought this was morally okay, and today we don't. And so our idea of what's right has changed. And they might provide you with an example of like in Iraq, they think this is okay, and over here in America we think this is okay, and over there in New Zealand they think this is okay. So, they would say that means morality is subjective, and it's just whatever people make it up to be. The issue here is key to understand is that one example of confusion about morality, so like if they provide multiple examples where we don't really know what the right thing to do is, that wouldn't actually prove that there is no objective morality. So that wouldn't prove that morality is purely subjective. Because you would have to prove that in every instance. So we don't have to make a case that we know what to do in every situation. All we have to do is come up with one example where we're certain about what to do, and that would prove that there must exist some objective morality, even if the lion's share of what those objective morals are still mysterious to us. We just need to know that they actually exist. Okay. Also, if morality is subjective, this means that like all life, everything everyone does is every bit as stupid as believing in Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. Because it means that in other words, you can't make choices without believing in objective morality. Because like if you decide to here's an example of a choice. Let's say that you decide to lose weight on January 1st. You make a New Year's resolution, you're going to lose weight. Or let's say you alternatively say, I'm not going to lose weight. That's a very boring life. I want to enjoy lots of delicious food. And That's more important. Well, if morality is subjective, it means that the value that any action you do possesses, the value of that action as good, bad, better, worse, or anything, is completely made up by you. So everything you do is all a fantasy made up by you. Because everything you do, you're choosing to do this instead of that. You're valuing doing this instead of that. Everything you ever do is all one big thing made up by you or made up by society. But it's all one big delusional fantasy because nothing you do is ever better or worse than anything else. So that's kind of absurd when you think about it. Alright. Now, here's the objection that always stumped me about this argument for a long time, and once I understood it, I was able to move on. Because I listened to people like Ravi Zacharias, and he oftentimes never made this point. He never really, it's such a simple point that like you don't hear it made much. But the question is, yeah, I understand that like there has to be objective morality, but why does objective morality require an objective, a moral lawgiver? And the issue here is morals are desires. That's fundamentally what they are. Morals are desires. So like that's what a moral is. I mean, if you understand the thing with subjective morality, then you get what I'm talking about here. Morals are desires. They're ideas about the way things ought to be, about the way things should be. They are desires. And so they are fundamentally to say that the morals exist impersonally without a personal being that creates them or is the basis of them, then it's like saying we have desires without a personal being, or like we have a personal being without having a personal being. Okay, so that doesn't actually make any sense. Now, one objection you might run into is, why can't humans just make the morals? And so Ravi Zacharias has a good response to this. Well, which person? You, me, you know, it should be Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Hugh Hefner, or Mother Teresa. Who's going to make them? You know, and if you say, well, societies can make the morals, that doesn't actually resolve anything, because now you got to ask which society. You know, the ancient Romans thought it was okay to have 80 to 90% of their society as slaves, in like some of the worst forms of slavery you can imagine, and we would think that's probably bad. Okay, so there you go. All right, now so this one you're probably never going to run into, but it's worth the time sometimes to go through it. If so, some people might be willing to just kind of explore it, even though they don't actually believe it. But the question of nihilism, just the total denial that there is such a thing as good and evil or right and wrong, just total nihilism, that nothing matters and that nothing, you know. All right, so first of all, we have this moral sense. We have a sense experience that like some things are really bad. Like if I was going to, you see things, people do things, and you just have this sense experience like that really shouldn't have happened. Okay, you cannot call yourself an empirical person and say that that sense experience of morality is all a big illusion. You know, that's like, you know, like if you come to a young earth creationist and show them all sorts of data about how the earth is, you know, 4.4 billion years old, you show them all this geology and all this data, and they say, oh, that's all a big illusion. Well, that's the same thing you're saying when you say that the moral sense is a big illusion. This is a lot of data. This is a sense experience and observation that people make all the time, every day, across all of human history. And it's further evidenced by the fact that people have laws and morals. They really believe this stuff. And so you just cannot call yourself an empirical person and just deny all that. If you're going to do that, then you're not empirical, because you're willing to wave your magic wand and just wipe away mountains of observational evidence. We can go a bit further. Okay, so this is going to get a little bit more philosophical, but we covered how you can't have a philosophical, like a physical processes or materialist processes can't explain where morality comes from. And so it has to come from somebody, not something. And even if it accidentally entered into that somebody, well, what caused the accident? You know, because the accident is actually the real source of the morality. Okay, now you could say that somebody who comes up with it is duped by somebody who is duped by somebody who is duped by somebody. Well, then you run into an infinite regress problem. And if you're familiar with the Kalam, you get why we can't have that. Now, therefore, whoever came up with it, it's like the metaphysical buck has to stop somewhere with somebody who actually knows. Because when you make up the lie, you know the lie is made up. You know. So therefore, there must be some moral lawgiver that knows if the morals are lies or not. Alright? Now, the moral lawgiver would have to know if there are actual morals. You think about it like, in other words, if someone duped the moral lawgiver into, you know, you run into the infinite regress problem. So you're going to have to get back to somebody that like knows whether or not there really is morality or not. And that's who's creating all of this sense experience. Because it can only come from somebody. Okay. Now the question is the moral lawgiver aware of the level of influence it has over giving us this sense experience? Because if it is, then it will give us its actual morals. In other words, it will make us behave in a way that it thinks is best, it truly thinks is best for us. Okay. Now, if it controls the sense experiences of all humans, then does it control them by accident? Well, then the question would be, well, who causes the accident? And we're back to the problem of a materialist explanation. Really, the source of the accident then would be, it would have to be somebody, not something. And then whoever that somebody is that's duping the moral lawgiver into giving us the morals would be the real moral lawgiver. So, the moral lawgiver must be aware, or at least the interferer with the moral lawgiver is the actual moral lawgiver. And we only need one moral law to verify objective morals. In other words, we don't need to look at every moral, you know, we just need one. And if we know, as long as we know that one thing is truly good, then there must exist objective morality. Okay? And then objective morality can only exist if God exists. Okay, so we only need one moral law. Let's choose honesty, the moral of honesty, that honesty is good. At least some of the time. It only needs to be good some of the time. Objectively good some of the time. You know, it might, you know, we don't have to go into all of the ethical arguments. Like, we just need to know that there is objective morality. Now, if the moral lawgiver honestly values honesty, then there must exist an actual moral law, even if we do not know all of it. In other words, like, it's going to give us its actual morals, and if it honestly values honesty, then there must exist an actual moral law. In other words, if it is giving us the moral of honesty, then that's something it actually values. But if it actually values honesty itself, then it's being honest with itself and with us, and you get the point. Yeah, so I put on here other interlopers can exist. So it's not like there can't be someone who's giving you some messed up morals. But the key is that honesty moral has to go, it has to break back to something that the moral lawgiver knows is for real. And then we know there's an objective moral law. Now, I can give you a different way of going about this. So this could be, you know, what I could give you. We'll give you something different. I'll give you a secular basis for morality. You exist. You make choices, right? Well, that necessitates that you value things. So it's impossible for you to live a life without believing in some sort of values and morals, because choice necessitates value. You know, you choose one thing versus another. To value, this might take a little bit of thinking, but to value a thing is to value it for what it is, not what it is not. And I'm not going to explain that other than just to let you mull over it. To value a thing is to value it for what it is, not what it is not. Therefore, it is wise to value honesty and reality. So that means that, like, we can actually derive from there a moral completely without God. But here's the issue. How can that moral exist in the very fabric of reality itself? That means that the very fabric of morality has an oughtness, has a desire, has a sense of goodness in it. Okay, alright, so now one objection that often comes up is the objection that God is immoral. So they point to Bible verses. So the issue is if you take a look at the Bronze Age and the moral values that people had back in the Bronze Age, they're looking at the Old Testament law of the Old Testament in the Bible and say, how does that, well, that's written in the Bronze Age. So what are the things that people valued and believed in that time? Well, for one, fathers pretty much owned children like property and could kill them as they wished. So we'll just start with that. Child sacrifice was common. Prostitution was a sacred, holy devotion to the gods. The list could go on. Humans weren't considered equal, so like when Achilles' gay lover, this is also in the Bronze Age, the story of the Iliad and the Trojan War. When Achilles' gay lover Patroclus is killed by the Trojan hero Hector, Achilles kills a bunch of slave children, Trojan slave children, as like payback. And it's seen as a bit excessive because he killed like a bunch, but like maybe it's understandable because Patroclus is such a great guy. Or alternatively, in the law of Hammurabi's code in Babylon, if I was to, or maybe not me, but like if a rich guy was to kill the daughter of another rich guy, then you wouldn't execute him for that. No. He would have to give a replacement daughter, and one of equal value. Okay, alright, so the question is this: how would you correct the Bronze Age? How would you correct the Bronze Age? It's not going to be easy. It makes more sense for God to let some stuff slide, but still try to correct things. And you look at the issue of one objection. There's sort of a mini objection. So atheists raise some mini objections to this. They really are big on this immoral God thing. So one mini objection they raise here is, why couldn't God Almighty, who's omnipotent, just fix the Bronze Age? Well, then you start to raise the question of just the problem of evil in general. Like, why doesn't God, just fix all human evil? If he's not going to fix all human evil, then he's going to have to work with us. So that just goes back to the problem of evil. Alright. There's also the issue of, like, if God just magically snapped his fingers and made all of us understand morality completely, with no confusion about it, then we would all be God. And I'll give you, we'll prove that. That'll come up with another objection that we're going to look at in just a minute. But, so, God would correct the Bronze Age gradually. In fact, Jesus affirms this in Matthew 19. He says, he's asked a question about, divorce from the Old Testament law because Moses permitted divorce. And Jesus says that, well, Moses permitted divorce because of your hardness of heart. So there he's saying exactly what I'm saying. He's saying, and, back then you guys were way out, and, God, through Moses, let some stuff slide. But that's not what God actually wanted. And then Jesus says, so one of the things before we get to what Jesus says after that, one of the things we look at with the Old Testament is God will be pushing people in a direction. So you've got to look at the direction that he's pushing. And then Jesus says, you go back to the beginning. Jesus says, but it was not so from the beginning. And then he looks at the earlier texts of Genesis and the things that are said there, and that stuff's supposed to be permanent, from where Jesus looks at it. But the idea is that, we've gotten off track, and so God's letting some stuff slide, but he's pushing in a direction. Now, the response atheists give to this is that we are no longer believing in absolute morals at this point. We're relativists because we've tossed away the Old Testament morals. But the issue is that Jesus was willing to toss them away, and the key issue to understanding these Old Testament morals is that they're pushing in a direction. And we can't really understand morality with perfection ever, because we would be God, and we'll get to that. But it's also, you go back to the Genesis example, and you can actually derive all sorts of good morals and even political laws from that. So, like, the basis for saying that slavery is wrong really historically came from the idea that humans are made in the image of God. And it's not just the idea that all people are equal, but that all people possess infinite value because they're God's image. So how much should you charge for, what would be the proper price? Another one you can get is in the Garden of Eden. They eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And what that represents is a shortcut to knowledge. And so a powerful moral is communicated through that, because Adam in the previous chapter is told to name the animals. That's the long cut, the long way, the long hard way to gaining knowledge. That's like the first thing you do as a little kid. You learn, like with your little kid book, or maybe you got a see and say, with the little lever on the side or whatever, but like cow, snake, chicken, turtle, doggy, like basic, some of the first knowledge you learn, to recognize these different things. Flour, and they were eating fruit, and they had to understand, the differences between, all of these fruits and then that, But, like, you could alternatively just eat this one fruit from this one tree and you'd know everything God knows. And that became very tempting for them. And essentially in life we do that all the time. Anytime someone is behaving irrationally, they're taking a shortcut to knowledge. An example would be just anytime there's racism. That's saying, I know this person without having to get to know this person, based on my racism, So, like, but anytime someone jumps to conclusions, makes assumptions, doesn't listen to the facts, is unreasonable, is irrational, or does anything stupid, what they've done is they decided they knew something when they didn't really know. They took the shortcut to knowledge. And the shortcut to knowledge is bad. Okay, so, there you go. All right. So it's not moral relativism when there's a directional component to the Old Testament law that's pushing in a direction, and when we have also what the New Testament tells us is, first of all, you go back to Genesis and you get permanent morals, and second of all, if you look at Jesus on the cross, you've seen the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus our Lord, what he says in Colossians 4, I think. But anyway, let's move on. One old objection that doesn't come up much, but sometimes I guess maybe, is the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is the question of, like, well, if God, how does God make up the morals? Does he just make them up subjectively? Like it's just something that he arbitrarily makes up for no reason at all. Then it would seem that the morals aren't really, there's no real reason why they, this is good and that's bad. God's just rolling a dice up in heaven or something. They're arbitrary. Or, alternatively, does God give us the morals because they're the right morals, but he gets them from some higher source? So is he making them up, or is he getting them from some higher source? And it's the dilemma. It says, those are the only two options, and either one you go to, it would seem like God isn't really the source of the morality, because if God gets it from a higher source, then that source is God. Well, again, this would just be, the metaphysical buck has to stop somewhere. Morals are desires, and so God doesn't get them from a higher source, and he doesn't make them up arbitrarily. God is the morality. And so therefore to know all the morality is to know all of God, and therefore to know all morals would be to be God. And so this idea that just because we're still learning about morality, it doesn't mean that it's not absolute. It just means that we're not God. Okay, then you got the problem of evil objection. You got to deal with that. The first little point to make is as soon as they assert the problem of evil, they're asserting that they're not asserting, but asserting that there isn't an absolute moral law. And then you've got the response from the book of Job. All this bad stuff happens to Job, and Job says, "Why, God, why, God, why?" And then God comes down and says, "Well, if you want to know why that happened, why don't you tell me why this, why that, and why a bunch of other things?" And Job says, "Well, I guess there's a lot I don't know." And so the idea is, God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil to exist. And just because we don't see a reason why, it doesn't mean that there can be no reason why. And in fact, why should we think that anything God does is ever easy for us to understand? It would all be difficult, right? And in the book of Job, Job's friends present a simplistic explanation of why bad things happen, just karma. And then it's made clear in that book that that's far too simplistic and it's incorrect. And God even says to Job, you need to pray for them. Okay, which is an interesting thing for God to say. All right, and then another way is a lot of times atheists don't like that answer. So if it's someone who's really belligerent, you can say, all right, if you were God, what would you do? What kind of world would you create? And more to the point, would you create a world where people didn't have the choice to be evil or good? That's amazing. I've never had an atheist ever really come back on that. It's like it just ends it. They don't want to shoulder the load. It's kind of like the person who complains about their boss all the time, but if you're like me and you are the boss, you learn what it's like to have that shoe on the other foot. Okay, now here's the tag argument. This is a weird one that I heard in a debate. This woman used Immanuel Kant's tag argument. Now Immanuel Kant's transcendental tag, it's a transcendental argument for God. But she used it for morality, and it's like, well, yeah, you use it for morality, but it would go on to God. But anyway, we won't go to the full tag argument. But she just said what I said before. Her position was that there's no such thing as right and wrong, but because it's impossible to live life without believing in right and wrong, she's going to believe in it anyway. So this is basically, she's a nihilist who just says that she's being practical. She just can't help it believing in right and wrong, even though she knows that there is no. Okay. And so that really just goes back to the nihilism question. And so for us, it would be it's an inherent property of reality, though some morals are actually better. Because then it's well, she has to believe in it. But see, my point with my argument, one of the ones I made is yeah, but you have to believe in certain morals, and those morals are intrinsic property of reality. Okay, and that means that the desire for things to be a certain way is an intrinsic property of reality. Okay, now the dumbest one you'll get, which comes at you a lot, I guess, is people say that that the moral argument for God is circular reasoning, and their position is what they're doing is, what they really mean is that the first premise that says if there's a moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver, they're assuming that that's just a bare assertion on your part and you don't have any way to back that up. And then they say circular reasoning to make it sound fancy, when really what they mean is you didn't justify that. But if they say you didn't justify that, then you say, oh, well, I'd like to justify that for you. But they want you to not do that, so they just want to say that you never do that. When in reality they just want to say that. They don't want to actually hear whether or not you have a justification. So there's that. Now, let's just move right on. I'm going to move right on to the Kalam argument. The primary issue with the Kalam cosmological argument, with everyone you talk to, it's always going to come up. Primary issue is the assumption of verificationism. Every time, that's exactly what you get. You get verificationism. What is verificationism? Verificationism is the idea that an idea cannot be considered cognitively meaningful. A statement cannot be considered cognitively meaningful unless it can be empirically verified with like sense observations or tools to augment the senses. And that any statements that are cognitively meaningful without that are tautologies. In other words, they're just like 1 + 1 = 2 is a tautology in the sense that it's just stating the same thing twice with different language. That's, yeah. So 1 + 1 means the same thing as 2. So let's see. The problem with verificationism, real quickly, there's a lot of problems with it, but the big problem is that it's self-refuting. You cannot empirically verify the idea that everything must be empirically verified to be trustworthy or reliable, much less meaningful. You can't empirically verify verificationism. If you did, then you would, it would be itself. So that would be circular reasoning. Okay, and so as soon as you break that down, you open up the door, and so to like other ways of knowing things, and so you can use pure rational reasoning to know things, because you can say like, okay, these are the only options logically possible, and then this option 1, 2, and 3, 2 and 3 have inherent problems in them that make them incoherent and impossible. That means that 1 has to be the case. Or maybe you can just narrow, maybe you have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you can just say, well, 1 and 3 are good, but 2 and 4 are out. So you can prove statements true, and you can even prove things about reality that have to be true just through deductive reasoning. So the Kalam can work that way. Now, a different objection you might get is that why can't time have been going forever? And they give you an example of a number line, and it starts at 0, and it goes positive infinity, and it goes to negative infinity. Okay, this objection isn't quite thinking about it correctly, because time moves in a direction. The number line is just a thing that's just there, and it's just long, but time moves in a direction. Okay, so if time moves it in a direction, that means that like every day is how many days have actually passed before today? An infinite number of days. And so every day is adding 1 to infinity, making it longer. Every day is the last day in infinitely long. We're counting to infinity an infinite number of times. I mean, really. Okay, because, okay. It's just mathematically absurd. And there's the other issue that if you know the Kalam, having an infinite number of things would, make all math meaningless. So I guess in the terms of time, you could say like, how many days have passed before today? An infinite number. All right. So if you number all of them, so like you take a set of all of them and you say, okay, that's infinity, and you pull all of them out. So infinity minus infinity equals what? 0. Okay. So let's say you number all of them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Odds and evens, all the way back to infinity. And you pull out all of the odd ones. How many did you pull out? Infinity. How many are left? Infinity. And okay, all right. So infinity minus infinity can equal 0 or infinity. Or let's try this. You take out all the ones before 10 days ago. So how many did you pull out? Infinity. How many are left? 10. So you see the problem? So you can like do the same exact mathematical equation of infinity minus infinity and get absolutely any answer you want. Which would mean that subtraction is meaningless. Which would mean that, you know, if that was true, then 5 minus 2 doesn't actually equal 3. Because subtraction has been debunked and meaningless. Or, an actual infinite number of things can't exist in reality. It's only a mathematical concept, but you can't actually have an infinite number of days before us. Because if that infinite number of days did actually exist, or like an infinite, you know, an infinitely big, you know, I don't know, I always say barrel of apples, then like you could actually do these mathematical calculations, because you can count out 5, you know, rocks and pull away 3 rocks, right, and then see how many are left. Well, if you have infinite rocks, then you could do all of these infinity calculations and debunk subtraction. Okay, so it's logically impossible. All right, so there you go. Now, on the issue of infinities, you could say, some people might say, well, we cross an infinite number of things all the time. So if I walk to the door is 6 feet away, but there's like an infinite number of points between here and the door. And what they mean is like you divide the distance between here and the door by 2, you get 3 feet and 3 feet. Two things of 3 feet. You divide it smaller, you divide it by bigger numbers, you get smaller and smaller distances, but more of them, more in the set. And so if you divide it like an infinite number of times, then you have an infinite number of points. And that doesn't really, you're not actually crossing an infinite distance between here and the 6 foot away door. It's 6 feet away. It's not infinity away. You're like, because if you divide it that much, then you're dividing it so much that like each of those distances, those little segments of distance are infinitely small, have no space in them, have no distance in them. Okay, anyway. Now, one you might get, sometimes these things are like, it's hard for me to take this seriously. You might be going through this. It's like, people actually say this stuff and it makes a lot of sense to them. And it's like, that's why, you know, I make these videos like this. I'm like, how can I wrap my head around making this clear for people? You know, but I hear this said to me. They say scientists are researching things coming from nothing. And so you can't say that it can't happen. Which, A, that's just an assumption of verificationism again. We gotta deal with that. Okay. But B, no they're not. They're just not. They're just not. They're researching empty space and they're finding that physical empty space, which wouldn't be nothing anyway, but they're finding that it even has some sort of physical stuff in it other than just empty space. And we're not sure what that is. And so it's really interesting because for a long time, a lot of the prevailing theories in science, like before Isaac Newton, said that there had to be some sort of immaterial stuff and there was no empty space. There was some sort, it was like these ether theories that existed. And then Isaac Newton came along with his ideas of like momentum and inertia, and that you didn't have to have stuff pushing stuff to make stuff move, that things could just move on their own inertia. And like, but now we're back to a point where like, no, we're finding through our observations that there is stuff even in totally empty space. So like, we're studying that, and so we call it nothing because it just makes it more interesting, you know, of a way of discussing it, because we don't really know what it is. And you say the quantum vacuum, and people are like, what? And they mean, so they say nothing. You know, it just makes it more intriguing to talk about. It's a marketing tool, you know. And like, particles emerge from this sea of quantum energy that we don't understand. And so things come from nothing, in a sense, quote unquote. Alright, now, scientists, but in the strict sense of nothing, or shall we say it more clearly, things beginning to exist without a cause of their existence, science can't really research that ever. So if you observe an event happening without a cause, and you observe no physical cause, well, there may yet be some unobserved physical cause. Is the best you can do with scientific observations, with empirical observations, is just rule out the likelihood of physical causes. You can just say that it's unlikely there's a physical cause. But it still leaves the problem Because logically speaking, we know that there's either a physical cause, there's a non-physical supernatural cause, or there's no cause at all. The issue is that the proposed concept of the non-physical would look just as invisible as nothing at all. So you're never going to empirically observe every one of those, because that's just, when we talk about the supernatural, we're talking about things that theoretically might exist, which are non-physical. What if they could exist? Who's to say that they don't? At least we should investigate the possibility. Okay, this would destroy all of science if things could come from nothing, because anything could happen at any time for any reason with no explanation. You could turn into, Adolf Hitler, or a goose, or all of those trolls we talked about could magically appear, like, I don't know, in your freezer for nothing at all, for no reason at all, with no explanation, and they happen because nothing happened, and you couldn't even place odds on it. So like, it would ruin all, like you're gonna say you're gonna bet on a basketball game, and the Atlanta Hawks win, and you say, why do they win? Well, they might have won for no reason at all, for literally because nothing happened. Not even because they played bad, they just won for no reason at all. Really? So like, what are the odds? I mean, how often does that happen? How would you set odds on like, if you're a bookie? How often does that happen? Well, nothing has no properties that dictate how often it, does something, because it's nothing. So like, the old adage is only nothing comes from nothing, but like, this would destroy all of science. I could add a bit more point to this argument, because all events that happen without a cause are impossible to stop. You can't stop them from happening. How do you stop them from happening? They just happen without a cause. What are you preventing? You're preventing nothing. What are you interfering with? So they're not contingent on anything else. So it leads to all sorts of logical impossibilities. I mean, you could have things happen that like God could be an indestructible being, and then he could just stop being God for no reason at all. But and he could be destroyed for no reason at all. And he, so like, God could pop into existence, or just start existing, or have always existed for no reason at all, and be destroyed for no reason at all. You run into all sorts of problems. Because all of those things would be impossible. Alright? The classic example is an unstoppable force in an immovable object. Because an immovable object, there's no real problem with an immovable object in itself, and there's no real reason an unstoppable force necessarily can't, at least logically, they can't exist. And so they could just come into being for no reason at all, on a beeline to meet up with one another, and then break down reality, because like, the immovable force can't be moved, and the unstoppable object, you get what I'm saying. Okay, now one thing you get from teenagers is that time is a man-made construct. I gotta borrow a great example from Joe Rogan podcast on this one. He said like, okay, you go underwater, hold your breath for 5 minutes. Has 5 minutes passed? Has an actual amount of time passed? Or let's say you show up 30 minutes late for class. Are you actually 30 minutes late? Or is the fact that you're 30 minutes late, you can tell the teacher, oh, it's just an illusion, it's just a man-made concept that I'm 30 minutes late. I'm not actually late. No, it's pretty clear, pretty fast, that the language we use to talk about time is a man-made construct. But time itself exists, and it's like, whoa, yeah, languages are man-made. Thank you, Captain Obvious. Okay, now Now, here's a more complicated way of talking about something similar. I've had this thrown at me. This is amazing because, like, people tell you, like, oh yeah, you know, these arguments for God's existence, you know, they're way over everyone's head. But then as soon as I go through one, people throw this stuff at me. Sometimes the least educated person in the room will throw stuff like this at me. You know, the B theory of time is, you know, all of a sudden we're into this like really weird concepts of time. You know that really is something that's being debated. This is like a legit question. The time is an illusion. There is no such thing as time. But rather, it's just how the universe works. It gives you the illusion of time, and it's based on Einstein's theories. Okay. So the weird thing about this is it's like, how is that different from the Kalam, though? Because the Kalam says that there's a being that exists beyond time, and we exist inside time. Because on the B theory of time, all events are really simultaneous. Which is kind of what the Kalam, that is what the Kalam's already saying. That from God's perspective, all events are simultaneous. But from our perspective, they happen one at a time. You move from, like, you know, Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday to Friday to Saturday. But for God, all of, you know, on the block theory of time or the B theory of time, like, all of those events are simultaneous. So, like, how is this different from what the Kalam's already say? I mean, and so here's the thing, like, let's say all events are simultaneous. But you know that you clearly experience them one at a time. Therefore, how many of them have you been moved through? Not an infinite number. And even if you forgot a bunch of them, doesn't matter. You can't have been an infinite number. So therefore, did it begin without a cause or not? Because the question is, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Okay. It only matters if time begins anywhere. Even if it just begins for you, there has to be some sort of cause for that beginning that's beyond time. Okay. Here's one you get. Aliens created the universe. You know, there was a cause, but the cause doesn't have to be God. Or they might say that the cause doesn't have to be a personal being. Okay, so if you're familiar with the Kalam, you understand why it has to be a personal being. Of course it has to be a personal being. Of course, personal being, because logically speaking, it's either a personal being or it's not. Fair enough. If it's not a personal being, then it does what it does based on its inherent properties of what it is, which would mean that its properties, given that it's timeless, its properties would timelessly cause the universe to begin to exist. And therefore the universe would just always be in that one moment of beginning to exist. That moment would be timeless. So, for the effect to be timely and the cause to be timeless, you can't have a thing, or an impersonal thing. And the only options are either personal or not personal. It says not personal is impossible and it must be personal. Given that we must exist, then that's the only possible explanation, because the other one's logically impossible. Okay. Alright, so then this being is timeless. It exists outside of time. It's not infinitely old, but it's totally beyond time. Which means that, like, it doesn't change in any way. It can't begin to exist. It's non-contingent. Its existence is contingent on nothing. It has an indestructible existence because it's non-contingent. It exists because it exists. Okay? Nothing caused it to exist. Therefore, this being cannot be created or destroyed. It would see all events at once. Therefore, it could make one choice that comprehensively thought about everything, because it knew everything, and it only need to do like one. But it wouldn't just make one choice. It couldn't be changed, and what it does is based on what it is. So that one choice flows from what it is, and that one choice of what it does is also non-contingent, which means that it's all powerful and all knowing. and eternal and the creator of existence. But it's not God. Okay, now let's look at the dumb objections. It says time cannot be caused to start because nothing can be before time. So this is like one of those dumb objections. What they're saying is like they assume that the only kind of cause is the kind of cause that like happens before the effect. That like you have effect then cause. What I'm sorry. Yeah. You have effect and cause is before it. So you cause this and then effect. And then that effect might be the cause of the next effect. And the blah, 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 blah. Cause, effect, one after the other. But why is that true? Why is that the only way that is? Why did you justify that? That's just a bare assertion that's like, essentially what that's saying is, the thing you're proving to exist, that there exists some cause for the universe beyond time, that's just impossible. Why is it impossible? Because I just asserted that it's impossible. Why? Like, you gotta back that up somehow. The whole point of the argument is to prove that this thing must exist. If you don't like it, well, pooty-poo on you. You say, well, I've never seen anything else like that. Well, pooty-poo on you. That's why we're proving it. Of course you hadn't seen anything else like that. We wouldn't bother to prove it if we saw it all the time. Okay, but you're just assuming that the argument's impossible by using different language, other than just saying, nuh-uh, you're wrong. But that's all you're saying is, nuh-uh, you're wrong. But you're dressing it up with different language to make it sound like you're saying something else. This is a bare assertion. Okay. One of the weirdest ones you get is, they say that the Kalam argument is an equivocation. Okay. Now, from what this one confused me because I was like, I hate to say it, but I know what the word equivocation means. And so I was like, what are they talking about? How? And so, here's the crazy thing. As best I understand it, they just kind of like the use of the word equivocation because it sounds fancy. And it's like, oh man, that's some real thought out thing. There's no way you can get around that word. Look at that word. It's not that fancy, okay? It's just like, here's a simple example. If I tell you that it's right to give to charity, therefore charities have a right to our money. You'll be like, oh, wait, what'd you say? Well, I made an equivocation. That's an equivocation. Equal vocal. Equivocation. It just means that the sound is the same. Vocally, right to give to charities, therefore they have a right to our money. The word right in both situations sounds the same, but meaning different. And so that's how equivocation works. So what they say is, when in the first premise, when you're talking about everything that begins to exist as the cause of its existence, they say that is a physical cause. But then in the end, in the conclusion, you're talking about a supernatural cause. It's like, where did you get that? We weren't saying that in the first premise. Where did you get that? They're assuming verificationist justification for the first premise as soon as they heard it. It's just like built-in assumption of verificationism. It's amazing. Okay, here's an extra dumb one. They say beings outside time cannot affect anything inside time. Well, the term outside time is just a way of talking about, a God who would transcend time. So like, that's just a misfortunate issue of the language because it's difficult to talk about, what we're talking about here. And so we use terminology that might not be super accurate. And then the old classic response is, who made God? Which, the issue about the who made God is that atheists want you to say this. They want you to say there has to be a first cause, and the first cause has to be God. Because everything has to have a cause, and the first cause. That's what they want you to say. They want you to say everything has to have a cause, therefore there's a first cause, and the first cause is God. And then you would say, well, who made God since everything has to have a cause? In other words, and then they label that as the classical argument that Christians have used for a long time. And it's like, that's why William Lane Craig made a point of calling the Kalam cosmological argument the Kalam cosmological argument, because Kalam is a Muslim word for the Middle Ages, because it comes from the Middle Ages. So they can't just claim like this is some new thing. It's old. This is not. So like they want you to claim that like you're not being traditional or conservative or something, and like this is some new trick that you've come up with. It's been around forever. It's been around forever. Okay, Muslims were talking about this in like the Middle Ages. Okay, so don't even go there. And then we got it's time for the final round. Final round time. The Christian objections. You know, I decided to add this in there. The Christian objections. All the Christians. There is a key to understand. Before you even start dealing with the Christian objections, and oftentimes I find you really shouldn't even bother. Whatever objection. So in other words, what Christians do is they won't actually say like what's wrong with your argument. They won't engage your argument. It's like icky. They won't even like they won't talk about the specifics of the argument or think about it, because as soon as they do that, they're like, it's like real bad. You know, so like what they'll do is try to justify why they don't have to engage with your argument and why they shouldn't even be bothering. They have a problem with the whole idea that you started proving God exists. They don't like that. And sometimes I get the feeling that they would rather be an atheist than accept the idea that you could prove God exists. Okay. So here's the real issue. Issues, there's two of them. But the biggest one is the problem of how does like the average believer in Christ, the regular person who comes to faith in Jesus Christ, how does that person know that God exists and that Christianity is true and all that? And so I'll just go through, and then the other one is like, well, how does proof fit into how people come to faith? So it's kind of connected, but there's slightly different. So how does the average believer know that God exists? Well, I'll put it to you in a simple way. There is a distinction between being able to explain something and having knowledge of something. Those are in two different categories. And if you can separate those two categories, then all sorts of stuff becomes possible. And in fact, that's actually quite common to everyday experience. How you feel at any given moment is actually quite difficult to explain. But that doesn't mean that you don't know how you feel. That you're not aware of it. And that you certainly don't know more about it than you're able to explain. Maybe you don't know 100% about it. Or like, an experience. A lot of times people try to explain experiences like what it was like to go there and see that and go through this. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to explain your experiences. And yet, it's very common to have this difficulty. But it doesn't mean that you weren't there or that you don't know what it was like. You know, and so if the Bible's true, the Bible says that all creation is proof for God's existence. Everything that's created. Well, all creation, that's everything you've ever experienced ever in your whole life, ever. Or anyone has. All physical reality. Okay, so like, if that's the case, then we're so overwhelmed with the proof for God that like we should have a hard time explaining it. And in fact, the arguments we come up with for God's existence, like the two we've given in this video, would really be like teasing out some of it, just a piece of the whole larger proof. And it takes a lot of work to do that. But we're not coming to you with something new. Now, people like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga, they respond to this question slightly differently from me. What they say is that, like, well, these proofs are great and wonderful, but belief in God is ultimately a properly basic belief, that we experience God in knowledge of God in the most direct and properly basic way. But the issue that I'm making, the point that I'm making, is that the arguments for God are part of a larger properly basic belief. And when I say properly basic, it makes it sound fancier than it is. In philosophy, you have to be so specific that you come up with terminology for things that make very basic things sound more complicated than they are. But a properly basic belief is something that's based on, like, properly basic knowledge. And it's like when the computer screen you're looking at right now, does it exist or not? You don't know, but the fact that you see a computer screen is properly basic. Like, there's no debating that, like, you obviously see it. So that's what we go all the way back to the earlier part of the video. We talked about the illusion of morality. Well, morality could be an illusion, but the illusion would have to be an illusion, and that's a big problem, because the experience of the moral sense is that, even if it's fake, even if it's an illusion, you still experience it. And so, like, if you see the computer screen right now, it may not exist. It may all be an illusion, but the fact that you see the illusion, that's properly basic. And so that's what they're saying. What I'm saying is, my point would actually connect the arguments into the properly basic. Okay, and that right there, actually, for a lot of times for Christians, that kind of resolves it. And it gives them an outlet to learn about this stuff without rejecting everything they've held true. The other issue is, how does apologetics fit into evangelism? And so we'll go through this very quickly. If what the Bible says is true, then everyone is overwhelmed with evidence for God. So if anyone rejects God, they don't do it because of a lack of evidence. They do it because they just want to be a poo-poo head and they don't like God. Okay, a hard heart. But that's not an easy way to live. I've got Bible verses we could go through outline this step by step in one short passage. But skipping that for now, it's not easy to live with just that opposition to something you know is true. You know it's true, but you're just super opposed to it. So, like, alright, I'll be honest. What you do is you come up with ways to rationalize why disbelieving in God was actually smart, even though you didn't actually do it because you had good reasons for it. You did it because you wanted to be a poo-poo head, because of the hard heart. But it's easier to take the denial of God and move it from the heart up into an intellectual headspace and come up with intellectual reasons. And so when you do, so they rationalize why it was super smart not to believe in God. And so that's where apologetics comes in. You're going to reason with people and remove all of those intellectual roadblocks that people put in, so you can get back down to the core issue of the hard heart. And at that point, the apologetics is over, and you can start working on, you're dealing with the hard heart. You're going to deal with that in different ways. The love of Christ is what melts the hard heart, but it's expressed in numerous ways. But anyway, so there you go. Now, let's go through some examples. One example, the most simple example is, I know it's true because I have faith. Or just have faith, or something like that. Well, that's just real dumb. Muslims have a lot of faith, so that's not going to answer anything. They're flying their airplanes into the World Trade Center. Those guys had faith in something else. So, obviously, having faith doesn't make it true. One time I heard somebody he gave all sorts of like psychological explanations that like what you had mental problems if you ever doubted the existence of God. It was a mental problem. I think if you don't doubt something until, you know, if you doubt something when you don't have, like, in other words, if there's an issue, if someone makes a claim and they give no proof for it, doubting that would mean that you don't have mental problems. The opposite is true. Like, why is that a mental problem? If I don't have proof for this, should I not doubt it? You tell me I got mental problems unless I believe in stuff with no... Wow, you know what kind of hurdles you jumping through? Okay, alright, well, we got, what's this other one? Oh, here's one I used to hear when I was younger. They would quote like this book is like the Bible, and Moses is all mad, and he's don't test God like you did back at Massa. You made God mad. Don't test God. And then Jesus quotes this when he's like the devil asks him to tempt him to like jump off the temple, and it says, "Don't put the Lord your God to the test." All right. So Jesus would have been performing this like great miracle or whatever. But like, the problem with their example is Jesus did perform a lot of miracles to prove who he was, who he said he was. So come on. And like, there's other verses, like, I forget where it is. I mean, it says to test things. And it's all boiled down to this word test. And like, God's talking there about testing his attitude. About testing, like, not testing does he exist, but testing just what he'll let you get away with. This is a different thing. Like, they really worked hard to like just get around the notion of giving proof. It's amazing. Okay, what's next? What we got? Now, here's one you get. Believing in Jesus Christ made people a better person, so that's all the evidence and apologetics you ever need. Now, the problem with that, boom, is that it don't prove anything. If believing in Jesus Christ makes people live a better life, that don't prove that it is true, because believing in Buddha helps people live a better life too. And believing in Muhammad changes cultures. And bottom line is that wouldn't prove it. Like, in other words, like, let's say someone came to you. Let's say that atheists were like the best people ever, and accepting atheism just made people become really moral. Would that make atheism true? Not necessarily. There may be some other explanation for that. The funny thing about these answers is, like, you get the same exact stuff from Mormons. Like, Mormons are really nice people, right? And so you should just be a Mormon because being a Mormon makes you a nice person. Is that, you buy that? You really that gullible? You gonna buy? Like, Karl Marx said, you know, religion is the opium of the masses. It could be just that instead of this being evidence that God exists or that Christianity is true, that it's a fantasy that makes you feel good about being a good person. And it just does a really good job of that. You know, Star Wars makes people want to be better people. It doesn't mean that the Force and the Jedi and the Yoda is real. Batman makes people want to be better. Okay. Okay, where were we? Oh, yeah, so that. It doesn't actually prove it. Oh, the Mormons, I'll give an example. I remember this, it was crazy. So, like, this was a great example of circular reasoning from this, like, Mormon missionary girl that came to my door one time. Of course, it was her and the other girl. Because they're always tag teaming. And, like, it was weird that it was girls, for starters. And they told me about how, you know, I gotta, you know, accept Joe Smith's a prophet. Joe Smith, he's a prophet. And he's a prophet. And so, like, how do I know? I was like, well, how do you know Joe Smith's a prophet? They told me that I gotta pray about it. I gotta pray about Joe Smith being a prophet. and God will let me know. And they say God will make me, feel good about it. Is what they said. God will give me a feeling that will let me know. Because Joseph Smith called it the burning in your heart, a feeling in your heart, and you'll know. And I was like, well, I don't know if I should really base my life on feelings. Like that sounds like kind of a wishy-washy way of finding out if something's true. This girl did not miss a beat. A beat. And she was like, she said, what did she say? The weird part was like she was so like in tune with this. So like when you're like in a bubble or an echo chamber where everyone thinks the same thing, then like dumb ideas start to make perfect sense to you, and you don't ever question them. And so like it like took me back. I was like, whoa. Like a lot of times when people reason in a circular way, it's like you don't realize like the dumbness in it. And I didn't realize it. I felt bad. Like I couldn't come back to her. It's like I'm still trying to. Man, I wish I could ever get that opportunity again and tell her like why it was so dumb, But like it was just like she was just so confident, and like it just didn't, the way she came across with it. But like this is what she said. She said that you get the fruits of the Spirit, which from Galatians 5. And when you pray about Joseph Smith, God makes you like you start feeling it like. The whole idea of Joseph Smith and all that makes you want to be joyful and peaceful and loving and faithful and all that. And so that's fruits of the Spirit, so that's from God. And it's like, okay, this is circular reasoning, because Joseph Smith told you he's a prophet, and he told you how to test whether or not he's a prophet. Come on. Come on. Okay, and then like here's the thing. Like of course she says that. She grew up like if she was raised a Buddhist, then she would say believing in Buddha made her feel good and made her feel like being a good person. She's raised in an environment where everyone tells her that. It's just not very hard-nosed proof. Okay, here's one of the crazy ones you get, and you get it way too often. I've heard it way too many times. I heard it from people who were trained in seminary. Of course, it was kind of a weird seminary. I've heard from people who weren't. Here's the one. They say that if you have knowledge, if you have proof, then that eliminates the capability of free will. And so there's no faith. You can't really make a choice or commitment of faith because you have knowledge. And so it's either knowledge or faith. You can't have both. And I think that's why people like RZIM, or no, it's a William Lane Craig's ministry is called reasonable faith. That like the two can go hand in hand. But like that's what people say. Faith, it means like you're making a choice to believe this, and if you have knowledge, then there's no choice element there. Okay, why is that? Why is that? Like why is that? Why is that? Think about like how much of your life is spent trying to convince people of things where they're being unreasonable and they refuse to accept something even though they're dead wrong. And in fact, think about this. I'll give you a hard-nosed proof. Think about all that you just like everyone else. There have been lies and you have believed them to be true. You have 100% fell for them. Okay? You should have said, maybe this is true, maybe it isn't. The fact that you didn't say that means that you went beyond what you knew to be the case. Because you knew that you don't actually know, but you decided that you know. How did you do that unless you can believe something that you know to be untrue? Okay, here's the other one you get sometimes. Christian apologists will say, give this. They'll say, the actual Christian apologists will say that we don't have any 100% proof. All we have is evidence. We have like arguments that make it likely. It's just probable that God's real. It's just probable that Jesus is real. All that. It's just likely. It's just we're just establishing a high probability. Now, first of all, this can be self-refuting. In other words, like if you say it's impossible to know for sure whether or not God exists, like, or how about this? Maybe that's not impossible, but if you say it's impossible to ever know anything with certainty about God, then the question would be, well, how do you know that? That's self-contradictory. But I'll just give you 2 Bible verses. Is this idea that like the best we can go on is just saying that we know that it's likely that God exists, or probably God exists? Well, that removes apologetics from the New Testament and what Jesus talks about and what the New Testament talks about and what the apostles are talking about. And it's like what the apostles are talking about is in one world and apologetics is in a separate world. Okay, never mind that Paul said the creation makes it obvious and it's clearly seen that, you know, that there's a God. So this separation shouldn't exist. So anyway, this is what, I'll give you 2 Bible verses. Hebrews 11, man, I think it's like 11:6. It says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He probably exists and that He probably rewards those who earnestly seek Him. Okay, that's not what it actually says, is it? Well, let's go to Romans 10, starting at verse 8 through 11. Okay. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God probably raised Him from the dead, you will probably be saved. I'm sure, because Paul's, you know, he just got good evidence too, you know. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth you profess and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in the probability of Him will never be put to shame. They might be for actually saying that, but they say that. They say that. You have like people write books and like they're like serious, like, you know, they say it from pulpits and stuff. You know, those podiums that get transformed into pulpits with the magic of tradition. And like so here's the thing. This probability stuff, we got to go beyond this, man. And hopefully I provided you a way to go beyond it, but you got to go beyond this, cuz like that's just not biblical. And it's just idiotic to believe it for no reason at all. So and the Bible talks about the reasons. Why are they not good enough for you? I don't know. Anyway, now let me give some I would like to give a defense of evidence-based apologetics at the end here, because these are 2 arguments that I think establish certainty, but you can give a lot of evidence-based arguments for God, and it's an interesting counterpoint to, you know, what I was just talking about, because the cool thing is evidence-based apologetics don't establish absolute certainty. And they just admit this from the get-go. So you can give like historical arguments for the resurrection or something. You know, or, you know, something based on like, you know, well, there's a bunch of stuff. Like, alright, so, the cool thing about this is people can accept the evidence and they can actually accept that, well, probably Jesus really did rise from the dead. But they don't have to actually become a Christian and accept that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. So what you're doing is you're giving people an out. You're giving people a way to listen to you and agree with you without also becoming a Christian. And it's funny, isn't it, that that's the cool thing about it, given that other people say that, you know, well, that's all you got. You know, you just, you know, the whole faith in Jesus is just accepting the probability. No. The cool thing about evidential apologetics is that you can accept the probability and like the likelihood that God exists without actually believing in God, without actually becoming a Christian. So you don't have to restructure your whole life or hate everything the apologist says those aren't your only two options. Okay, alright, so. Oh, a ton of stuff we talked about there. Thank you for your time.